They say some secrets are buried so deep in the bloodline that even death cannot silence them. In the foggy highlands of Scotland, there existed a family whose name was whispered only after dark, the Greystones. For over 2 centuries, this family followed a tradition so disturbing, so unnatural, that when the truth finally surfaced in 1987, it sent shockwaves through the entire country. Twin brothers married twin sisters, generation after generation, in an endless cycle that defied nature itself. But what they discovered in that old estate's hidden basement would reveal a horror far worse than anyone could have imagined. This is not just a story about forbidden marriage. This is about what happens when bloodlines become cursed, when tradition becomes torture, and when the dead refuse to stay silent. If you're ready to dive into one of the most disturbing family secrets ever uncovered, stay with me until the end, because what I'm about to reveal will change how you see family traditions forever. And if you're fascinated by dark folklore and true mysteries, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because we uncover stories like this every week that the world tried to forget. The Greystone estate sat on the edge of Loch Morar, surrounded by ancient pine forests that seemed to lean away from the property, as if the trees themselves knew something was terribly wrong. The mansion was built in 1764 by Alaric and Morgana Greystone, twin siblings who had married twin siblings from a neighboring clan, Aclan and Rowena MacTavish. Local records show that this wasn't a simple marriage of convenience or political alliance. The 4 of them participated in a ritual that predated Christianity in Scotland, something rooted in old Celtic beliefs about twin souls and the preservation of magical bloodlines. The village priest refused to conduct the ceremony, so they brought in someone else, someone the records only refer to as the keeper of old ways. That night, witnesses reported seeing strange lights emanating from the estate and hearing chanting in a language nobody recognized. From that very first union, the pattern was set in stone, or rather in blood. Alaric and Morgana had twin boys, Declan and Rowena had twin girls, and when those children came of age, they married each other. Then their children did the same, and their children after that. For 8 generations, the Greystone family tree didn't branch outward like normal families. It twisted inward, folding back on itself in ways that made geneticists who later studied it feel physically ill. The family kept meticulous records in leather-bound journals, documenting every birth, every marriage, every death. What they didn't document openly was the real reason behind this obsessive tradition, but clues were scattered throughout their writings like breadcrumbs leading into darkness. One journal entry from 1823, written by twins Callum and Cora Greystone, reads, "The blood must remain pure. The gift must be preserved. We have seen what happens when outsiders enter the line. The screaming in the walls begins, and the mirrors show us what we truly are." Another entry from 1891 states, "Mother gave birth to them again last night. They look just like the first ones, just like they always do. Father says this is proof that we are succeeding, that we are keeping them contained. But I hear them scratching inside the foundation. They are getting stronger." These cryptic passages meant nothing to outsiders, but within the family, everyone knew exactly what they meant, and everyone lived in absolute terror of breaking the tradition. The village of Glenmorag, the closest settlement to the estate, had its own stories about the Greystones. Old women would cross themselves when the family name was mentioned. Fishermen refused to cast their nets near the section of the loch that bordered the Greystone property, claiming that something lived in those waters, something that wore human faces but wasn't human at all. Children were taught never to approach the estate, never to make eye contact with the Greystone twins if they came to the village, and never, under any circumstances, to accept an invitation to visit their home. There were stories of people who had violated these rules, people who were never quite the same afterward, if they returned at all. One story from 1934 told of a traveling merchant who stayed overnight at the estate and was found 3 days later wandering the moors, completely naked, speaking in a language nobody understood, with strange symbols carved into his chest. He died in an asylum 6 months later, still screaming about the ones in the walls, and the real twins who live in the mirrors. But despite all the whispers and warnings, the Greystones were also one of the wealthiest families in Scotland. Their fortune came from unclear sources. Some said ancient gold, others claimed dealings with European royalty, and the darkest rumors suggested they had made bargains with entities that predated human civilization. Whatever the source, their money kept them protected, kept authorities at bay, and kept the tradition alive. The family employed servants, but never for long. Most would leave after a few weeks, pale and shaking, refusing to speak about what they had witnessed. Those who stayed longer often disappeared entirely, their absences explained away by the Greystones as sudden departures or returns to distant homelands. But the villagers knew better. They knew the estate had an appetite. By the 1970s, the Greystone family had dwindled significantly. The intense inbreeding had taken its physical toll. Even if the family attributed their survival this long to whatever dark protection they believed they had. The current generation consisted of twin brothers, Malcolm and Magnus, married to twin sisters, Isla and Iris. Between them, they had produced another set of twins, boys named Alaric and Declan, named after the founders, as tradition demanded. But something had shifted in this generation. The boys, despite being raised in the tradition, despite the constant reinforcement of the family's beliefs, had begun to question everything. Alaric in particular had managed to attend university in Edinburgh, the first Greystone in generations to receive outside education. There, he had studied genetics and had begun to understand exactly what generations of inbreeding had done to his family, and what it would do to future generations. When Alaric returned to the estate in 1985, he was a changed man. He had met a woman at university, someone from outside the bloodline, someone he loved desperately. Her name was Catherine, and she represented everything the Greystone tradition forbade. Malcolm and Magnus, along with Isla and Iris, were horrified when Alaric announced his intention to marry Catherine and break the cycle. Family gathered in the Great Hall, that ancient room lined with portraits of twin ancestors staring down with identical eyes, and they told Alaric exactly why he could never leave, why he could never marry an outsider, why the tradition could never be broken. They took him down to the basement, to the part of the estate that he had been forbidden from entering his entire life, and they showed him the truth. The basement wasn't just a basement. It was a series of tunnels that extended deep into the rock beneath the estate, tunnels that had been there long before the house was built, tunnels that Alaric and Morgana had discovered in 1764. At the center of this underground labyrinth was a chamber, and in that chamber was something that defied rational explanation. The walls were covered in symbols that hurt to look at, symbols that seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at them. And arranged around the chamber were what appeared to be bodies, dozens of them, preserved in some impossible state between life and death. But the horrifying truth was that these weren't bodies of strangers or victims. They were previous Greystones, the twins from every generation, their physical forms kept in this chamber, while something else, something that wore their faces, lived upstairs in the mansion. Malcolm explained it to Alaric in a voice devoid of emotion, a voice that suggested he had made peace with this horror long ago. We are not truly the children of our parents. We are vessels, containers for what lives in this chamber. the real Greystones, the original Alaric and Morgana, made a pact in 1764 with entities that existed before this world took its current form. These entities needed physical forms to experience reality, to feel and taste and live as humans do. In exchange for allowing this, our family was granted wealth, protection, and a form of immortality. Every generation, when twins are born, the entities transfer into the new vessels. The old bodies are brought here, kept in this state, while the consciousness, the entity itself, continues in the new form. The inbreeding isn't about genetic purity. It's about maintaining the specific biological resonance that allows the transfer to occur. Outside blood would break the pattern, would trap the entities in dying vessels, would end the pact. Alaric stood there, staring at what he now understood to be his own future body, the vessel he would eventually become when his consciousness was replaced by whatever ancient thing wore his face. He looked at his father, his uncle, his mother, his aunt, and he finally understood why their eyes sometimes seemed so old, why they occasionally slipped and used archaic language, why they knew things about history that they shouldn't possibly remember. They weren't entirely human anymore. They were composites, human biology hosting something far older and far stranger. And the most disturbing part was that they seemed content with this arrangement, grateful even, as if the original human consciousness had been gradually overwritten until nothing remained but acceptance. But Alaric refused to accept this fate. He fled the chamber, fled the estate, and returned to Edinburgh where Catherine was waiting. He told her everything, and to his amazement, she believed him. Catherine was a researcher in parapsychology, someone who had dedicated her life to studying exactly these kinds of phenomena. Together, they began to investigate the Greystone history, digging through archives, interviewing elderly villagers, and consulting with experts in ancient Celtic practices. What they discovered was that the Greystones weren't unique. Throughout history, there had been several families who had made similar pacts, families whose traditions revolved around maintaining specific bloodlines for entities to inhabit. Most of these families had eventually died out, either because the tradition was broken or because the inbreeding caused fatal genetic defects. The Greystones had survived longer than any other recorded case, and that made them both fascinating and terrifying to researchers. Catherine discovered something else in her research, something that gave them hope. The pact, according to fragments of texts she found in university archives, wasn't unbreakable. It required willing participation from each generation. If twins refused the tradition, refused to marry and produce the next set of vessels, the entities would be trapped in their current hosts until those hosts died naturally. Without new vessels, the pact would end. But there was a catch. The entities wouldn't go quietly. The texts warned that breaking the pact would result in violent retribution, that the entities would fight desperately to preserve their arrangement, that they would use every psychological and physical manipulation available to ensure compliance. The texts described previous attempts to break similar pacts, attempts that ended in murder, suicide, and madness. Armed with this knowledge, Alaric made a decision. He would return to the estate, confront his family, and refuse to participate in the tradition. His brother Declan, who had also begun to question the family's practices, agreed to stand with him. In the spring of 1987, the two brothers returned to Greystone Manor for what they knew would be a final confrontation. Catherine came with them, as did several researchers and, crucially, a documentary filmmaker who Alaric hoped would provide protection through exposure. If the world knew what was happening at Greystone Manor, the entities couldn't simply make them disappear. The family couldn't hide anymore. What happened next was captured partially on film, though much of the footage was later deemed too disturbing for public release. the brothers confronted Malcolm, Magnus, Isla, and Iris in the Great Hall. They announced their intention to break the tradition, to marry outside the bloodline, to refuse to produce another generation of vessels. The parents' reaction was immediate and terrifying. Their faces contorted in ways that human faces shouldn't move. Their voices dropped into registers that human vocal cords shouldn't reach. And they spoke in unison, in that same ancient language witnesses had reported hearing during the original pact ceremony in 1764. The temperature in the hall dropped dramatically, condensation forming on the walls, and the portraits of ancestors began to move, their painted eyes tracking the brothers as they backed toward the door. The entities inhabiting the parents made their intentions clear through broken English mixed with that otherworldly tongue. The boys would participate in the tradition, or they would be taken to the chamber below, and their bodies would be used as vessels regardless of their conscious cooperation. The entities had done this before, they claimed, when previous generations had shown resistance. They would hollow out Alaric and Declan from the inside, wear their faces, use their bodies, and the world would never know the difference. They began advancing toward the brothers, moving in that synchronized way that twins sometimes do, but exaggerated, inhuman, like puppets controlled by the same strings. Their hands reached out, fingers too long, joints bending at wrong angles, and their mouths opened wider than human jaws should allow, revealing something dark and writhing inside. But Alaric and Declan had prepared for this. Following Catherine's research, they had brought iron, salt, and fire traditional protections against supernatural entities across multiple cultures. They had also brought something more modern, thermite charges placed strategically throughout the estate's foundation, set on a timer that would give them exactly 15 minutes to get everyone out. Alaric's plan wasn't just to refuse the tradition. It was to destroy the chamber below, to destroy the preserved bodies that somehow anchored the entities to this reality, to end the Greystone pact permanently. As the possessed parents advanced, Alaric triggered the timer and announced what he had done. The entities inside Malcolm, Magnus, Isla, and Iris screamed with voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once, a sound that shattered every window in the manor and sent the cameraman fleeing outside. What happened in those final 15 minutes is a blur of contradictory accounts. Alaric and Declan both reported that their parents seemed to fight against the entities controlling them, that brief moments of human consciousness broke through, begging the boys to run, to save themselves, to end this horror once and for all. Catherine reported seeing shadows detach from the parents' bodies, shadow forms with too many limbs that tried desperately to reach the basement chamber. Filmmaker, from his position outside, captured the most disturbing footage, shapes moving behind every window of the estate, dozens of shapes, far more than the 6 people who were supposed to be inside, shapes that pressed against the glass as if trying to escape, shapes that wore faces identical to the portraits in the Great Hall. The entire estate seemed to be writhing, the building itself appearing to breathe and pulse as if alive. When the charges detonated, the explosion wasn't as large as expected. Instead of a typical explosion, witnesses described it as an implosion, as if the estate was being pulled downward into the earth. The ground buckled and cracked, the ancient stone walls collapsed inward, and a sound emerged from the wreckage that people in Glenmorag reported hearing clearly despite being over 2 miles away. It wasn't quite a scream and wasn't quite the roar of collapsing stone. It was something else entirely, something that made people's ears bleed and caused pregnant women to go into premature labor. The sound lasted for exactly 7 seconds, and then there was absolute silence. No birds, no wind, no sound at all for nearly a minute. When sound finally returned to the world, Greystone Manor was nothing but a crater filled with rubble. Malcolm, Magnus, Isla, and Iris died in the collapse. Their bodies were recovered 3 days later. and the autopsies revealed something that the coroner initially refused to include in his official report. When he finally did document it, after intense pressure from Alaric and the research team, he noted that the internal organs of all 4 bodies appeared to be centuries old, mummified, despite the fact that the bodies had only been dead for days. Their brains, when examined, had unusual structures, regions that shouldn't exist in human neurology, tissues that appeared almost crystalline under certain lighting. Genetic testing revealed DNA so damaged by generations of inbreeding that the researchers were amazed the 4 had been able to function at all, let alone appear relatively normal to outside observers. The leading theory, never officially confirmed but widely discussed in parapsychological circles, was that the entities had been somehow repairing the genetic damage, keeping the vessels functional far longer than nature would have allowed. The chamber beneath the estate was completely destroyed, but excavation teams did recover fragments of what had been down there. The preserved bodies that Alaric had described were reduced to ash, but the ash itself was anomalous. It didn't match the chemical composition of burned human remains. Instead, it contained elements that shouldn't exist in biological matter, isotopes that current science couldn't explain. The symbols carved into the chamber walls were documented before excavation was permanently halted. Linguists and occult researchers studied the symbols, and while no complete translation exists, fragments suggested a cosmology where consciousness was viewed as transferable, where identity was less important than experience, where beings from outside our dimensional space could taste reality. Through carefully prepared human vessels, Alaric and Declan both left Scotland immediately after the estate's destruction. They did eventually marry, Alaric to Catherine, Declan to a woman he met in Canada where he relocated. Neither had children, both agreeing that even though the pact was broken, even though the entities were gone, they couldn't risk passing on the genetic legacy of the Greystone family. The documentary about their experience was never officially released, though portions have circulated in academic and paranormal research communities. The footage is considered some of the most credible evidence of supernatural phenomena ever captured, though it remains deeply controversial and is dismissed by mainstream science as an elaborate hoax. The crater where Greystone Manor once stood has never been built upon. The land was purchased by a conservation group and declared a nature preserve, though locals know the real reason the area is cordoned off. People who venture too close report feeling watched, report hearing sounds that shouldn't come from empty forest, report seeing figures in the distance that vanish when approached. Twice in the years since the estate's destruction, twins have been born in Glenmorag, and twice those families have reported strange occurrences. Doors opening on their own, children speaking in languages they've never learned, mirrors showing reflections that move independently. Both families moved away quickly, taking their twins to different countries, desperate to escape whatever residue of the Greystone legacy might still linger in the region. The Greystone journals, most of which were recovered from a fireproof safe in what remained of the estate's library, are now housed in a private collection at the University of Edinburgh. Access is heavily restricted, granted only to serious researchers who can demonstrate legitimate academic purpose. Those who have read the complete journals report that the later entries become increasingly disturbing, with the human handwriting gradually replaced by something else, something that formed letters in ways that hurt the eyes to read. The final entry, dated the day before Alaric and Declan returned to destroy the estate, reads simply, "They know. They are coming. We have lived so long, tasted so much, experienced centuries through these borrowed forms. We will not go willingly back to the void. We will find new vessels. Blood calls to the blood, and there are other families, other traditions, other chambers waiting beneath other forgotten estates. This is not an ending. This is merely a closing of one door and the opening of many others." Researchers have spent years trying to verify whether other families like the Greystones exist, whether there are other estates with chambers beneath them, other bloodlines maintained through generations of inbreeding for purposes beyond human understanding. The answer appears to be yes. There are patterns in genealogical records, families that show similar structures, similar traditions, similar levels of wealth from unclear sources. Most refuse to be studied. Most maintain their privacy with legal and financial power that makes investigation nearly impossible. But occasionally, someone breaks free, someone like Alaric who sees the truth and chooses humanity over whatever promise of continuity the entities offer. And when they tell their stories, they all describe similar things: chambers beneath estates, bodies preserved in impossible states, consciousness that moves from vessel to vessel, and entities that have been experiencing our reality through human forms for far longer than any of us could imagine. The question that haunts researchers isn't whether the Greystones were unique. They clearly weren't. The question is how many other families are out there? How many other chambers exist? How many twins throughout history have been born not as individuals, but as vessels prepared for something ancient to inhabit? And perhaps more disturbing, what happens when these entities can no longer find willing families? Will they find new ways to create vessels? Will they move beyond the traditions of inbreeding and family pacts into something more insidious, more widespread? Some researchers believe we're already seeing evidence of this, pointing to increases in twin births globally, to unusual genealogical patterns in certain wealthy families, to cases of children who speak of past lives in unnervingly specific detail. Alaric Greystone is now in his 60s, living under an assumed name in a country he won't disclose. He occasionally corresponds with researchers, always through anonymous channels, always careful to protect his location. In his most recent communication, received in 2023, he wrote, "I thought destroying the chamber would end it. I thought breaking the tradition would free us. But sometimes, late at night, I hear them. Not in the walls or in the mirrors, but in my own thoughts, in the space between sleeping and waking. They whisper that the pact was deeper than I understood, that it was written into the family's DNA through centuries of careful breeding, that destroying the chamber merely scattered them rather than banishing them entirely. They whisper that my choice not to have children doesn't matter, because the blood finds a way, because genetic legacy spreads through cousins and distant relatives, because somewhere out there, twins are being born who carry enough Greystone DNA to serve as anchors. They whisper that they are patient, that they have existed for eons before humanity and will exist long after we're gone, that they can wait for the right combination of genetics and circumstances to manifest again. And the most terrifying part is that I believe them. The story of the Greystone family stands as a warning about the dangers of tradition maintained without question, about secrets kept for so long that their original purpose is forgotten even as the practice continues. But it's also a reminder of something darker, that our world might not be as straightforward as we believe, that consciousness might not be as unique and individual as we assume, that there might be things waiting in the spaces between dimensions, things that view human bodies as nothing more than temporary vehicles for experiencing reality. The Greystones maintained their terrible tradition for over 200 years, creating an unbroken chain of vessels for entities that should never have found purchase in our world. They did it willingly at first, seduced by promises of wealth and power and continuity beyond death, but eventually the choice became irrelevant. The tradition maintained itself through momentum and fear, and whatever will the entities themselves could exert over their hosts. What happened at Greystone Manor in 1987 was supposed to be an ending, a clean break from centuries of horror. But endings are rarely clean, especially when they involve forces that operate outside the normal rules of our reality. The entities that inhabited the Greystone twins for 8 generations didn't simply vanish when the chamber was destroyed. Energy cannot be created or destroyed. only transformed. And if consciousness is a form of energy, then perhaps the same rule applies. Perhaps they were dispersed, scattered, weakened, but not eliminated. Perhaps they're waiting, searching, reaching out through the genetic traces left behind in distant relatives, in people who have no idea they carry Greystone DNA, in twins born in seemingly normal families who suddenly begin exhibiting strange behaviors or speaking in languages they've never been taught. The researchers who studied the Greystone case have noted an unusual pattern, an increase in twin births among people with even distant genetic connections to the family. Twins who often display an uncanny level of synchronization beyond what normal twin studies would predict. Twins who sometimes seem to share not just behaviors, but actual thoughts and experiences in ways that suggest something more than typical twin telepathy. Several of these modern twin pairs have been studied extensively, and while no definitive conclusions have been reached, there are disturbing hints that something of the Greystone legacy continues, that whatever made those vessels suitable for habitation by ancient entities might still be expressing itself in the bloodline, diluted but not extinct. The village of Glenmorag has never recovered from the Greystone estate's destruction. The population has steadily declined, young people moving away to cities, older residents passing on without replacement. Those who remain don't talk about the Greystones, not to outsiders, not even to each other. The memories are too painful, the implications too disturbing. But on certain nights, when the fog rolls in thick from Loch Morar, when the wind makes the pines creak and sway, locals report seeing lights where the estate once stood, lights that move in patterns too deliberate to be natural phosphorescence or reflected starlight. They see shapes in the fog, twin shapes that walk side by side in perfect synchronization. And sometimes, very rarely, they hear voices in that ancient language, voices that sound like Alaric and Morgana from 1764, or Malcolm and Magnus from 1987, or perhaps something that wore all their faces over the centuries, something that is still calling out, still trying to find its way back into our reality, through whatever cracks in the dimensional walls remain. If you're still watching, if you've made it through this entire disturbing story, then you understand why some family secrets should never be kept, and why some traditions should be questioned, no matter how ancient or sacred they claim to be. The Greystone family maintained their horror for 8 generations before someone finally had the courage to end it. And even that ending wasn't complete. This is why we research these stories, why we document them, why we shine light into the darkest corners of history and folklore. Because ignorance doesn't protect us. Because pretending these things don't exist doesn't make them go away. Because the only defense against something this insidious is knowledge and vigilance and the willingness to break tradition when tradition becomes monstrous. If you found this video disturbing, thought-provoking, or fascinating, make sure to like and subscribe because we dive deep into stories like this every week. Stories that most people don't want to hear, but that everyone needs to know. And if you have your own experiences with strange family traditions, with things that don't quite make sense in your genealogy, with twins who seem a little too synchronized, share them in the comments below because these stories need to be told. These warnings need to be heard, and who knows, maybe somewhere out there, another family is preparing to break their own terrible tradition, and they need to know they're not alone.